Okay, so Francis, you can get started. Seems like there's some technical difficulties with Thomas.
Sounds good. All right, guys, so take two here. Thank you, everybody, for joining at 5:30 on Wednesday during your busy week. Thomas is actually joining us from Norway today, so it's just having a little technical difficulties. But welcome to the Sustainability Committee's third post-COVID event, entitled S and ESG. This is a three-part series. I don't want to take up too much time as we're already at 5:35. But I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the day, Sheryl Owen from HLW. And Sheryl is also one of our most recent members, new members to the Sustainability Committee, joining us about January or February. So without further ado, I'm going to let Sheryl take over.
Thank you everyone for joining. This has been a great, I guess, love of what I really wanted to do for a long time, is about addressing the S and ESG, or the social impact reporting. So thank you for attending our first webinar as part of this series. And today we're going to look at how companies can provide more robust goals to assess their impact on their surrounding communities and their supply chain. But before we dive into the presentation, I just want to kind of discuss some housekeeping items. So what you want to do is to make sure to place your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And we'll get to your questions at the end of the presentation. And if there are any questions that we weren't able to get to, or if there are other questions that you may have for the panelists, their emails will be at the end of the presentation, and you can reach out directly to them. And this session is currently being recorded. So diving into why we're even having this conversation, and the ESG industry really needs to improve their measurement of social performance, and needs to move beyond just measuring the efforts and really their true effects associated with social impact reporting. There has been a lot of strides in developing and creating environmental goals, so the E in ESG, and even so developing policies, whether internal or external, that are in alignment with your environmental goals. However, we're substantially lacking in addressing our social impact. We have three amazing panelists who has done research on this very topic and work in the industry to understand and apply social metrics. They will also look at some of the frameworks and standards that helps organizations unlock opportunities for reevaluating the way they complete social impact reporting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Casey O'Connor, who leads the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights efforts to develop improved social measures for investors. She was the principal author of the center's 2017 report, Putting the S in ESG, Measuring Human Rights Performance for Investors, which examined how prominent sustainability measurement frameworks define and evaluate social performance. Building on that research, Casey tested a new model for social metrics in the apparel industry and is now developing a framework focused on drivers of income inequality across industries. Prior to joining Stern, Casey held various research and advocacy positions focused on human rights and economic development. She has a JD from NYU School of Law and a BA from the University of Washington. Our second panelist, Natalia von Hausen, works for Measurable and advances sustainable and actionable solutions through investment grade data. In her work, she ensures customers successfully use Measurable to manage, analyze, and improve ESG performance, and to disclose this data for sustainability reports, CDP, and GRESB. Natalia is a passionate advocate for intersectional environmentalism and earned a degree in environmental design from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And then we have Jenny McMinn. As Managing Director of Urban Equation and Partner of Innovation and Impact at Windmill Development Group, Jenny provides both real estate development and sustainability advisory across North America. Jenny draws on her experience with Windmill Development Group, one of Canada's most well-known and accomplished green building developers, to assist her development clients in reaching their sustainability goals. Her most recent clients include Sidewalk Labs, Oxford Properties, Quadrille, as well as all levels of Canadian government. Jenny is actively advising on over 20 million square feet of carbon neutral community development. Jenny is regularly invited to lead large interdisciplinary development teams through design innovation and sustainability. Jenny's unique background allows her to generate compelling value propositions that deliver impact in sustainability with a positive finance return. Over the last 15 years, she has consulted with both government agencies and developers to develop award-winning high-performance green building and community design projects, including those targeting One Planet Living, Living Building Challenge, the WELL Standard, and LEED Platinum. Jenny sits on the board of directors for the Canadian Green Building Council and was recently recognized for leadership in sustainable design through her nomination to the City of Toronto's Design Review Panel. Her expertise in delivering One Planet Living projects was recently recognized through her One Planet Living Integrator designation. Prior to working in sustainability full-time, Jenny worked with internationally renowned London, England-based architectural firm Fosters and Partners. Jenny has a Bachelor of Architecture and a Bachelor of Environmental Studies, both from the University of Waterloo. So a great panelist that has done research and currently work in the industry around creating metrics around social impact reporting. So they all have something of great value. And we're gonna get started with Casey O'Connor, and she's gonna be focusing on her research around putting the S in ESG.
Thanks, Sheryl, so much, and to the whole Cornet team for putting this on. It's really a pleasure to be kicking us off, and I'm looking forward to learning from you all in the discussion about the S in the context of real estate. So if you'll advance for me. I thought it would be useful to begin our discussion just making sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of what ESG investing is and how it may differ from some of the other socially oriented investing and giving approaches that you may have run across. So this pyramid, which I've borrowed, I think is helpful in delineating some of the common approaches. You see at the top philanthropy, which is really has solely a social objective. And then as you progress down to the base of the pyramid, you increasingly have a financial orientation to the strategy. And so you'll see here that ESG integration down at the bottom is really keeping those financial goals front and center and is a bit distinct from SRI investing, socially responsible investing that was very common in the years preceding this real explosion in ESG, which did have more of a blended approach in terms of placing the social values first and foremost and being willing to sacrifice some of the returns through screening in or out of sin stocks or coal industries and things like that. So ESG integration that I'm going to be talking about today is really about taking a performance on these environmental, social, and governance factors and integrating those alongside traditional financial analysis as a way of identifying companies that are really thinking through these challenges and managing with these challenges in mind to ensure that they are sustainable and resilient in the long term. And what we've seen is that there's been a real interest in this ESG integration style in recent years in particular. So this shows the growth in just US-based Google searches for the term ESG over the past 10 years. And you see that there's been a fairly stark increase in the last 5 years in particular. And we've seen that this has translated into a change in investment behavior as well. And we've seen real funds flowing into these ESG or assets flowing into these ESG dubbed funds. And this is something that many in the industry expect will continue, and that doesn't seem to have been curtailed in the context of the pandemic. So UBS, for instance, expects that ESG funds are going in the US are going to increase by 58%. in the next 5 years, and a Greenwich Associates study from last year that surveyed institutional funds and insurance companies found that 60% of those that they surveyed expected to have the majority of their assets managed with ESG criteria within the next 5 years. So this is a really exciting time for ESG, and I think also a very important time for us to collectively stop and really critically examine the data that are underpinning these strategies, and to make sure that we are first and foremost looking at the right issues, the most consequential issues, and also the issues that have the greatest potential to be disruptive to a firm or an industry or the market more generally. And then also looking to ensure that we are really accurately assessing corporate performance with respect to those issues. And I think most people that you would speak with would say that the S is failing on both fronts. So this has really long been the stepchild of ESG and has trailed the quality of data and the degree of integration in comparison to its environmental and governance counterparts. And the good news is that right now there's greater interest and attention in the S than ever before. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to correct that imbalance and to bring the S more in line with its peer factors in the near term. Also, this pandemic, I think, has cast a very clear priority on the issue of income inequality, and really made that the sort of social equivalent to climate change in the environment, and given a focus for us that has maybe eluded it in the past. And we've seen that both in the sort of the different experiences that high and low wage earners have had in the context of this pandemic in terms of their ability to continue to work and to work safely. But also we're beginning to see that same sort of bifurcated experience as this recovery begins to take shape. The higher wage earners have been able to save and are going to recover fairly quickly, have remained employed this entire time, and many of the low wage earners have gone into debt, have permanently closed their businesses or lost their jobs. And so we're going to continue to see an exaggeration of this issue that predated the pandemic. And so while this issue of income inequality is undoubtedly incredibly complex and multifaceted, and many dimensions of this reside squarely at the foot of government, I think there's been a lot of interesting conversation about the role that business has to play in managing these forces and in kind of exacerbating or improving this issue. And I've selected here a quote from Ray Dalio, who is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world, who I think puts this kind of business role very succinctly. So capitalism is now working in a way in which people and companies find it profitable to have policies and make technologies that lessen their people costs, and this in turn lessens the large percentage of the population share of society's resources. And so really what I think Dalio is getting at in this quote is that is helping to explain a bit of how we ended up in a situation with so much wealth concentration, and how the sort of natural cost-cutting strategies that have emerged over time, automation and outsourcing, have disproportionately disfavored low-income communities in a way that we're now, again, seeing so starkly in the context of the pandemic. And this is really an issue that is entirely absent from most ESG assessments. It's really a blind spot for the current approach to ESG. So looking at 85 US ESG ETFs, for instance, only 17 of them mentioned labor, workers, supply chains, or human rights. And instead, the S themes were really very idiosyncratic and wide-ranging, covering things like firearms and tobacco, religious preferences, global sanitation, GMO involvement. So really ran a wide gamut of issues. And this stood in pretty stark contrast to the E, where 100% of the time, climate change was among the issues that those environmental, that these ESGs were considering when it came to the environment. So we now have I think, a point in time where we have both the interest and we have a clear social priority with which to provide better focus for the S. But we also need to look at the second question of how well we are assessing high quality performance with respect to this issue. And so this harkens back to my earlier research from a few years ago, where I examined social indicators across 12 prominent frameworks. And these ranged from major corporate disclosure frameworks like the Global Reporting Initiative and SASB, to investor-oriented frameworks like the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes and the kinds of data that are being incorporated into the Bloomberg terminal, and then also some socially or social specific frameworks like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And so the first finding from this research was that in looking at just these 12 frameworks, we had over 1,700 social indicators to assess. So this is an incredibly voluminous space of measurement. And that makes this both very costly, and it also serves to really dilute the significance of the performance on the key issues. And it can cause a lot of noise and be very confusing to the investor audience as well. We also found that social measures tended to be very vague and that they rarely focused on the core business drivers of a firm or an industry. And so here we see that this was actually particularly pronounced, the vagueness problem, with those investor-focused frameworks. So 45% of the indicators that we looked at in those investor-focused frameworks relied on terminology like social or human rights or relevant or significant without any further definition. And so this really serves to obscure kind of gradations of performance and to collapse very disparate levels of performance into one category. So for instance, you may have a company that has really taken great pains to develop a very robust human rights policy. They've had a lot of really meaningful conversations. They've engaged with a lot of their significant stakeholders, and that shows in their policy. And that company would receive the same score as another company that just put 3 words related to human rights on their website. So, so that is one major issue. And then the second issue is that most of these social indicators are focused on evaluating the robustness of corporate social responsibility programs and the outputs of those, without really taking that next step to say, you know, are these really having the intended effect of changing the way that business gets done on a day-to-day practice, and looking for evidence of that. Excuse me. Sorry. Toddler challenges are real. All right. And so that kind of leads into this, which I think is really the most significant finding of the research, which is that of those 1,700 indicators that we looked at, 92% of the indicators were focused on monitoring corporate efforts. And the vast majority of these were looking at activities. So most social measures out there are evaluating, say, the number of trainings that are offered, or policies or statements that are issued, perhaps committees that are constituted, but they really aren't taking the second step to evaluate whether those are having the intended effect. And this particular dimension of social measurement is especially bad when it comes to outsourced labor. And again, kind of harkening back to some of the drivers of rising levels of economic vulnerability, this is a major blind spot. So we see that when we were looking at social indicators that were focused on labor, if that labor was the direct workforce of that company, then these were actually among the strongest social indicators that are out there. We saw that 37% of the time, these were really effectiveness oriented indicators, looking at the actual, or tracking actual outcomes for workers in the direct workforce. But when we shift into the workforce that are in these third-party relationships that are increasingly substantial and common, that those effectiveness indicators disappear entirely. So this has led us to propose a new model that would have 4 characteristics. So S really needs to improve by focusing on both the core business and core social concerns. What are the profit drivers in a given industry that are in tension with providing good jobs, or that otherwise serve to deepen vulnerability for low-wage communities? You also need to, recognize this big structural shift in our economy and in the way that firms are structured, and examine social measures need to examine the full value chain. So really cover all substantial relationships and not just those direct employees. They should be looking to evaluate the efficacy of efforts, which means that they need to really be measures for good management that are used systematically in daily practice. And then finally, it's really important to be precise. Key terms need to be defined and indicated in these indicators in order to allow for comparison year on year for a firm, and then certainly to allow for comparison across the industry over time. So I know that this was a little bit long, so I'm not going to go into, during Q&A, I can go into some specific examples from the apparel pilot, but I think I'll stop there for now to make sure that there's enough time for everyone.
Thank you, Casey. This was informative. And if anyone in the audience have not read Putting the S in ESG, I encourage you to take a look at it, where Casey has done a good job of really evaluating a lot of the ESG metrics that we in the real estate or even the ESG industry look at, and that we use to define social impact reporting. So we're going to move on to Natalia, who works for Measurable, and she's going to talk about some of the social metrics and how do you start defining that when it comes to social impact reporting.
Awesome. Thank you again, everyone. My name is Natalia von Hausen. I'm located in San Diego, so good afternoon for everyone tuning in from all over the planet. Super excited to be here. I want to just start off again just to thank CoreNet New York chapter and the entire team today for putting this together, collaborating on this, and discussing this extremely important topic. So Casey has laid me up quite nicely, since I'll be talking about what measuring the S in ESG looks like, specifically for the real estate industry and also at a higher level. Recent trends that we've been seeing over at Measurable with the work we do and the companies we collaborate with, and then finally how to implement social initiatives and metrics in your overall reporting and management. So you can, yeah, awesome. So this slide is a little little dense here, but I'm going to read a few of these headlines for you. Sustainable investing is set to surge in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Elevating racial equality requires a holistic ESG approach. Increasing body of evidence bolsters case of for ESG investing. Bank of America will incorporate diversity analysis of asset managers after huge amount of client requests. And the one that stands out to me the most, sustainable investment funds just surpassed 1 trillion for the first time on record. So although ESG is somewhat fragmented and dynamic, a trend that is extremely notable is that sustainable or ESG focused funding and investing has shown less volatility in 2019 and more importantly in 2020 when compared to conventional funds, even amidst the global pandemic. Now, what does this mean? Even though ESG was labeled a bull market phenomenon, from the results we've seen in 2020, investing with a conscious has become a priority in the finance world. And even though up until recently, as recent as of 2019, E was really the driving force of ESG. In 2020, we're seeing the rise of social and governance pillars as a reaction to companies' response to the pandemic and diversity, inclusion, equity, disclosure. We can go to the next one. And ESG strong companies showcase what resiliency looks like in the face of not only climate destruction, but social unrest and unforeseen epidemics. Low rates of furlough, maintenance of clients or tenants, productive and prideful employees are just a few identifiers of what a resilient company is. We can go to the next one now. And ESG strong companies showcase what resilient, and these market trends do not seem to be slowing down, especially since on the fundamentals of ESG is to identify areas of improvement and continuously improve as time goes on. So what is the value of ESG for real estate with an emphasis on social? Well, when it comes to developing and nurturing a dependable yet dynamic social program, a company will need comprehensive and detailed social impact tracking, managing, and improvement, which may eventually result in many benefits. And here you can just see a few. By allowing avenues of communication internally and externally, a company can better understand not only their workforce, but their tenants and consumers, governments, and investors. And this is ultimately going to be supported by the data, both quantitative and qualitative, that is managed and that Casey has discussed before me. With more communication companies will be more positively ingrained in communities and neighborhoods they exist and operate. And it's important to note that more likely than not, the employees that work at the companies reside in those same communities. And by having more representation and communication, analysis of risks will become more innate as the sources of information will be more accessible. And then by understanding your risks, this kind of segues those risks into opportunities through strategic planning. Next will be less turnover rate. So a study at UC Berkeley showed that it is cheaper to promote within than it is to hire and train someone new. Now, I'm obviously not saying to not look outside of your company, but promoting within is essentially a line item when looking at budgets and over your fiscal year, and is something that is positively affected when your company practices transparency and inclusion. And then finally, with all of these elements together, you'll be able to develop a more trusted relationship with all relevant stakeholders. Keep in mind that the value of ESG is not limited to these items here, and the value that flourishes looks different company to company. And I also want to kindly remind everyone on this call that sustainability and ESG is a journey. No one's expecting a newborn baby to run a mile 4 weeks after birth. So think about ESG in that light: to crawl, walk, and run. Crawling is going to be the chapter of self-reflection and collection. Walking is going to be the management and disclosure of that. And then running is going to be that constant improvement and identifying those low-hanging fruit. And then still staying on that scenario of crawl, walk, and run, ESG tracking and reporting did not become what it is overnight. It really has been a massive reaction to many factors on all parts of society. So who or what are driving these calls for social disclosure? Well, I broke it out into two indirect and direct tiers. The indirect drivers can be perhaps natural or unnatural environmental disasters or social disasters. Think a hurricane versus a pipeline oil spill. These situations intersect with frontline communities, bottom lines of companies, or property value. One that is more recent is, of course, COVID-19. Any of these situations can result in communities destroyed, jobs lost, economic despair, lack of healthcare, dwindling air, water quality, and all of these intersect in so many ways. These situations ultimately will cause a reaction from multiple tiers of our society, and that kind of segues me into that direct tier. So you have your consumers or your tenants who are voting with their dollar and supporting companies that represent their values, employees who look to supplement and build up companies that represent them physically and morally, and then you have investors who demand transparency and who really lay down requirements such as diversity from the board level down or disclosure of carbon emissions. And then finally, government mandates. Now, government mandates does vary across the globe, and we'll touch base on this in a little bit. I do want to showcase the investor demands, just because it is something that has been, in my opinion, a parallel with the rise of social impact when looking at how the environmental pillar has risen and evolved. And to showcase one specific request from an investor is Richard Lacaze from State Street's global CFO, and a direct quote was, as long-term investors, we are convinced that the lack of racial and ethnic diversity and inclusion poses risks to companies that senior management and board should understand and manage. And that's exactly right. So another example would be Arjuna Capital, that have requested companies' diversity data as recent as of August 2020. And then finally, I'm sure a lot of you have heard or are familiar with BlackRock CEO Larry Fink's infamous letter in 2019 that not only has put companies on watch, but if they don't divest from fossil fuels, disclose climate risk data, or promote ESG products, but beyond that have actively voted against boards that have not shown progress. So the investment and finance world really has shifted from how much money or what is the ROI of this investment to how resilient and responsible companies are with respect to the social, environmental, and societal factors. And this is really just the beginning of the ESG era. We've gone from green to sustainability, and today what we see ESG. Each pillar has had its own individual evolution. Of course, there's so many intersections and it's very comprehensive and complex. But like I mentioned, we are seeing a lot of parallels between the development of the S that we have seen with the E. And to quickly review these elements here listed here, we've gone from nice to have to essential. And this is probably the main driver for the rest that follow. And this is because the financial value that companies have for being transparent and inclusive is stark when compared to companies that do not. Many companies have begun to explore ways to redefine diversity and inclusion, and a study conducted at Cornell in 2017 shows that executives who consider inclusion a top priority have grown over 32% since 2014. Diversity tracking leads to better representation. So by understanding the makeup of your workforce, you can make governance level decisions that reflect this. Think diversity at the management and board level, like I mentioned a little ago. Companies that fail to promote inclusive policies face a number of financial risks, including acquiring and retaining employee talent. Think that less turnover rate. And according to data from human resources consulting company Mercer, 64% of workers in entry-level positions are white. And in the top executive ranks, however, 85% of positions are held by whites, demonstrating the promotion gap that minorities face. And I mean, we can talk about also the gap between male and female, women and men. Going back to one of the initial values that I discussed a little ago of community involvement, this results in lower risks overall and a holistic engagement that is more than just setting up shop in a community or neighborhood, but ultimately becoming an integral part of it. And the more that companies self-reflect and discern what social impact and tracking looks for them, the more opportunities they'll be able to identify from their workforce to capital projects to new investments, etc. So we've been talking at a high level what S looks like, but what does it look like specifically for the real estate industry? So here are a few elements I've seen in my work, directly working with corporations and real estate companies, helping track not only environmental data, but looking at social aspects as well. And some elements that I didn't include on this slide, but maybe more relevant on the higher level could be include but not limited to our CEO pay ratio, gender pay ratio, injury rate, human rights, board diversity, board independence, collective bargaining, etc. So tracking your social metrics is part of the beginning and preliminary steps. And again, just going back to that continuous improvement. But what do we see or predict for the future? How do we move the carrot for social factors? Like I mentioned before, we're seeing parallels. We're seeing consumer tenant reactions, investor demands, government mandates. And we move this carrot by increasing and defining those standards. And this ultimately will require increased involvement of all companies, because essentially we're disclosing this information so that we can learn from one another. And how does this materialize around the world? Well, tracking social metrics does not only look different company to company or industry to industry, but social metrics specifically is going to vary country to country and region to region. For example, parts of Europe, you can't necessarily ask about race because of the history with the Holocaust. If you're looking at parts of Asia or Africa where there are more homogenous societies, diversity and inclusion is going to look differently, and the tracking of those metrics is going to look differently. In the United States, for example, it is mandatory for companies to disclose racial metrics to the government, but this information isn't public. And then if you look at Latin America, diversity varies from country to country based on histories and current governmental practices. Now, referring back to the stages of your ESG journey, those who are advanced or the runners have been tracking and acting upon these metrics for years now. Those in the growth or intermediate step that are walking are following the pathway set by those ahead. And the beginners or early adopters, the crawlers, are tuning into the demands and trends and strategizing on the data and information collection. But overall, companies and corporations are responding to these pressures and disclosing this information, and no one wants to get left behind. So what are some ways that you can disclose your ESG efforts and data? And these are some that I've seen more commonly in the real estate industry. I know Casey had a few more, which is incredible because there's so many, and that is something that is kind of a pro and a con depending on how you look at it, because it's very segmented and there's no real one standard. But the fact that there are all these standards is a great sign. It's just a matter of, focusing on one and figuring out what's material to you. So as you can see on this slide, there is a lot, and disclosing standards are broken out into three main categories related to real estate. So we have voluntary disclosure, guidance framework, and third-party aggregators. So the three shown here on the left showcase the range of how ESG disclosure has evolved. We have GRESB, which stands for the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which is dedicated to real estate. CDP, which is dedicated more to environmental impact at a corporate level. And then Dow Jones, that looks at the top performing companies in the Dow Jones Index in terms of their ESG criteria. And what do they all have in common? Investors are looking into these disclosures under a magnifying glass because they're the ones that are probably demanding that their counterparts are reporting to this. The center group is going to be the guidance frameworks. And companies use this to essentially set up their ESG data and essentially what's material to their company and their industry. Whereas the first three are essentially a set of questions, the middle three are a framework that companies leverage to disseminate the comprehensive story that makes up their ESG data. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have the aggregators that look at all the public information that may be reported using the left group, and they refer to everything that's being disclosed, measure the depth, the extent, quality, performance, and rank companies and corporations on set risks, opportunities, preparedness, etc. So now you're probably all wondering where, oh yeah, and we could go to the next one.
Natalia, we're running short. If you can just sum this up.
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
we'll
we're almost done. Yeah. So where do we go from here? How do we start? How do we improve? So first is to, like I said, develop the foundation of your ESG program, figuring out what's material to you and your company, your team, and things like engagement surveys, quantifying the makeup of your company. That'll open up the dialogue with it internally. And then from there, you can establish organizational priorities like you see on this slide. And like we always say over at Measurable, you simply cannot manage what you don't measure. So to make actionable solutions, you have to identify your measurements first.
Great, thank you. Very informative, and thank you for focusing on like how do we measure the social metrics when it comes to real estate and ESG. So we're gonna go to Jenny, who's gonna talk about a project that she's worked on that includes social metrics, and how does she define that and what does that look like specifically for the real estate industry?
Thank you, Sheryl, and thanks to all of you who have made time in your evening to keep listening to us. So I appreciate the energy and the enthusiasm. Certainly a topic that's near and dear to our hearts. So I'm going to share some stories about our journey, particularly on the asset side. So there's been a lot of discussion on the kind of corporate side, and I would like to take a minute to, or through this presentation, share some of our real estate project history, specifically those that have pioneered change, to help demonstrate how the series of incremental innovations that we've seen take place in the green building movement, or the E and ESG, can offer us some good lessons learned, and hopefully launch us forward in a meaningful way. This first slide that Sheryl has on the screen now, it's not sexy, I get it. It's a green building project, first gen. I worked on it nearly 20 years ago, but this was the first LEED certified project in Canada. And it's important, next slide, because I think it demonstrates the early movement and the kind of first stage of innovation. Third-party certifications were helpful. They were a needed first step to inform the incremental innovation that we've been witnessing in the green building industry. And they really help to create shared language and start building, frankly, much needed capacity and a willingness by the real estate sector. Next slide, please. The second wave or stage of innovation, we would refer to somewhere in the kind of the process innovation aspect. And projects like you can see on the screen here really pioneered some approaches that tackled more holistic thinking. This project is a project in Victoria, BC. It's called Dockside Green. It was the first LEED Platinum for neighborhood development communities. And it really started looking at a triple bottom line approach that included, in the real estate or the asset side, we say people, planet, profit, but it's not dissimilar, I think, in relation to ESG. You can flip to the next slide. While this project achieved a number of groundbreaking aspects, particularly in regards to planet-focused innovation, it had some very creative solutions that started to tackle how those innovations could be profitable. Some worked well, not all did, admittedly, but it set a stage for how we could tackle those innovations. I would say that as a community, it didn't yet get into the weeds on having measurable social innovation, other than starting to define a process that might work to help us start to envision how we wrap our arms around this triple bottom line or more holistic approach. So the next stage of innovation, I think, continued to push on this process piece, particularly in our work. Some projects had obviously already moved beyond just prescriptive checklists, energy innovation, and many are frankly still starting to tackle issues like health in real estate development. But we knew as a developer that more could be done. In particular, as we started to address the building, or continue to address new communities that we were building. And so, we hadn't really found a green building framework that we thought yet adequately addressed social innovation. We were drawn to an organizational tool and an endorsement tool called One Planet Living. And the reason, frankly, is that it offered a very simple premise, one that we could understand and we could easily communicate with any stakeholders who may be interested in joining us on this movement. And quite simply, as North Americans, we use between 3 and 5 planets worth of resources. Obviously, we only have one. That's a simple message that we thought could help kind of navigate what has become a lot of noise. I can't remember if it was Casey or Natalia had mentioned, there's this kind of greenwashing thing that happens when people don't get what is the big mission, what is the vision. And so we really liked the One Planet Living methodology for that reason. In addition, within the system itself, it's comprised of 10 principles. It has some of the basics on the P or the E side, if you will, basics, quite progressive, but still focused on planet. Zero carbon, sustainable water, waste, etc. What we were really intrigued about and continue to work on is some of the aspects and principles they have around behavioral change. A focus on health and happiness as an example. Who would have thought that we would think of that as real estate developers? A real focus on intention around equity and local economy. And so this started to shape what we felt was a meaningful North Star, if you will, for our next development project. Sheryl, if you can flip to the next, which is called ZB. So we used One Planet Living. This project is now the first One Planet Living endorsed community in Canada. It's about a $1.2 billion mixed use community in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. as you might glean from the image, it was complicated in every possible aspect. It straddles 2 cities, it straddles a riverway, it's in 2 different provinces, federal interest, First Nation interest, you name it, this project had it. We used the story of One Planet Living and an attempt to be a truly sustainable community as a thread that could start to weave some of these complications together and actually create some meaningful opportunity. Next slide. So as part of our OPL process, there was a significant aspect of engagement. And one of the key deliverables for a One Planet Living project is the creation of what's called a One Planet Living action plan. So it effectively becomes the plan, if you will, and it includes some obvious things like setting specific project outcomes, indicators, targets, metrics, and you write them from scratch if you're tackling a One Planet Living project. Very exciting, not for all projects, not all are willing to put that time in, and it does take time. And so we set targets, including equity and local economy, and the project is a few years on now into operation and continues to report on an annual basis. You can flip to the next slide. And so while it was important to set a direction, and the One Planet concept certainly helped us do that, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of metrics and KPIs. And I think, you know, we with the right intention, we knew both we needed to connect with the complexities, particularly that of the Algonquin community and the land claims that were on the site. Admittedly, we had no idea how challenging it would be. And we quickly learned how rewarding it could also be. So as a private developer, we chose to partner with the Algonquin community to work together to define an engagement process and to, where we could, co-create together. And so frankly, the starting point was there was controversy as to whether this project should be built at all. What was really fascinating and exciting about the real commitment to partnership was over time, this extension of friendship initiated what we feel is a new conversation between developers and First Nations groups. It yielded us an opportunity to help learn from the elders and to really co-create a meaningful set of principles within our One Planet Living action plan that have shaped not only the physical elements of the project, but really over, as it's built out, we'll celebrate the Algonquin culture, traditions, there's trilingual signage, and also importantly, really integrate the Algonquin community into present economy. So not just celebrating the past, but really contribute towards job creation as well through the project. Next slide, please. So while certification systems and measurement are very important, and they continue to be important to us, next slide, please. What we learned on ZB was that too much focus on credits, measurement, and KPIs, next slide, can truly prevent, if not kind of done so conscientiously, can prevent us from seeing the forest for the trees. And next slide, please. I think the biggest accomplishment for us on the ZB project was not getting the plaque or the certification of One Planet Living so much as it was creating a real method for partnership with a First Nations community. And so one of the lasting aspects of this, one of many, is the creation of a Memingweshi Council. And this council is made up of female elders from the Algonquin community who volunteered time, shared stories, shared their wisdom, and helped us understand culture and respect for the earth as well in a whole new light. And so we've learned a lot, and this council can now inform other real estate projects as well. Next, please. So our next development opportunity is also located in Canada, a different city. This is the Baker District. It's located in Guelph. This is just actually 2 weeks ago was awarded as the second OPL endorsed community in Canada. It has about nearly 500,000 square feet of residential as well as institutional use, and it's being delivered in partnership with the city of Guelph. Next slide, please. So as we embarked on this next journey, we really wanted to continue to better understand what our real planetary impact is, both the social elements as well as the environmental bits. So we continued to evolve our systems thinking. we spent a bit more time really modeling the planetary footprint of the residents in Guelph. And what was interesting in that look is it looked beyond the bricks and mortar and actually started to look at all of the choices we make as residents in a community, including transportation, food, purchasing, waste generation, all of those things. And so it helped us identify beyond the kind of environmental aspects of the bricks and mortar, that food, as an example, in the Guelph community is the next largest contributor to planetary impact and demand. And so that really helps shape our process and our focus for this site. Next slide, please. We knew that we're not experts in food. We knew that we needed to connect with the larger community, and luckily the city of Guelph has quite a lot of resources in this way. The project itself will become an active learning lab and food growth pilot site. We've got a number of interested parties. One of the most interesting ones I've pulled from a number is a group called The Seed. Their aim and mission is really to tackle food insecurity. What's interesting in partnership with this real estate project is, as a developer, we don't always have a long-term footprint on the site. And so the Seed is a group who will come on board as an educator, agriculture operator, and a community outreach partner. And so they both helped us shape the physical aspects, but also create this longer-term benefit for the larger community. Next slide, please. And I know we're running tight on time, Sheryl, so I'll move quickly. Just another element of that I think was a successful piece was really connecting with the community and acknowledging all the local experts and actors. And so as part of this process, we created webinars that celebrated and brought all of the experts in the food community, including farmers and local politicians, et cetera, to really start to shape a more meaningful dialogue and connection with food. Next slide, please. So with all of that, I think coming full circle from the green movement and the E and towards S element, as we looked at that planetary footprinting exercise, what we realized, maybe we didn't like it, but as developers, we don't have all the control. We can have a big impact, but we can only impact so much of what will inevitably impact our planetary resources. We need communities to step up, to be excited and motivated to want to also play an active role. And so I think the data helped us get there, as well as the real connections, and that we, on our journey towards true One Planet living, we have, as a developer, more truly understand how much we need community involvement. And so exciting, but no shortage of heavy lifting. Next slide, and the next ones are really quick, Sheryl, I promise. So all of that said, as we continue on our journey and we reflect back on the green building movement and the incremental innovation that both the movement has seen and we have seen as a company, it's not enough and it's not fast enough. And we get that. There's a need to shift from this incremental innovation to more of a paradigm innovation. Next slide, please. Not only for the planet, but also socially, the disconnection that we're seeing. And so our next steps within our organization, next step please, is to really work on cultural change. And so internally, we are looking to dismantle the mechanistic or hierarchical approach to our business, to really inspire and have our own individuals connect with their what is most motivating to them, and set this larger purpose for which they can grow and inspire others. And so the hope for us, next slide, and it's the last one, is that through this learning and modeling internally of breaking down some of the structural systems that we're still stuck with, or that we're getting stuck with, is this paradigm shift and towards real cultural innovation that celebrates the individual. And with that, I will end. Thank you, Sheryl.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Natalia and Casey. We only have 2 minutes for questions, but I'm going to just ask one generic question, and then I'm going to have each of you probably just answer it. So when setting social metrics, who else should be involved with the conversation within the company? So not even, we talked about partnerships, we talked about engaging the community, but in order to set those social metrics, who else needs to be involved with those with those conversations? Maybe Natalia, if you want to take that to begin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every single important stakeholder that is affected environmentally and socially needs to be brought to the table, and I think that's where the focus is. You need a broad representation to make these decisions, right? But I think ultimately it's going to come down to what's material to your company, and that's one of the initial steps for any company trying to build out their ESG program.
Casey or Jenny? No. Okay, we can go to the next question.
No, I think Casey.
Oh, she on?
Casey was trying to say something, but I don't know. Her mic it doesn't look like it's working.
Can we go ahead? Okay. For Casey, I think this one would be good is, so how do we ask clients and companies to start addressing the vulnerabilities that they may see in their community? So that may look like, in order to build resilience, right, essentially, where do they begin to look to assess what would be the most impactful for their local community?
What we've seen is really that it is the most direct, most pervasive impacts of a given organization are going to be those points of tension between the main profit drivers of your firm or your industry and the logical social consequences that flow from that. So that is a really helpful place to begin your assessment and say, what is this point of tension, and then how do we manage it? So those points of tension don't go away, but you can do a better job of managing them. And so, to speak quickly to that apparel pilot that I didn't go to in depth, in that industry, this demand for faster, cheaper production is the point where companies have really needed to dig in and to say, how do we manage this demand in a way that doesn't require, the consistent exploitation of labor to accomplish it? And the leading companies in that industry are finding a way by building, more trusting relationships in the way that Jenny described in the context of the real estate industry, but really not shying away from that scary point within your firm or your industry, and taking that on and being creative. And I think that's where you can really find some meaningful innovations for your firm.
So it's 6:31. I know I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I really do. And this was great content. And we couldn't get to everything. It's a big topic for an hour. But you have Casey's, Natalia's, and Jenny's emails, and you can reach out to them directly if there were any questions that we weren't able to get to. But thank you to the panelists. Thank you to our audience. We have our second webinar as part of this series coming up, so be on the lookout for that. Another great topic where we're going to talk about looking internally and reflecting within an organization in order for you to start defining what those social metrics should look like for you. So be on the lookout for that information. Thank you. Have a good night, evening, wherever you are. Enjoy. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Sheryl.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.